At 18:25 hours on December 24th, 1944, boatswain's mate, second class Frank "Red" Sullivan, stood on the heaving deck of HMS Brilliant and watched American soldiers plummet 40 feet through freezing darkness onto steel plating designed to kill submarines, not cushion human bodies. He was 26 years old, red-haired Irishman from South Boston, assigned to the British destroyer as American liaison officer after 3 years serving in the Atlantic convoy system. The SS Leopoldville was sinking 50 yards away, torpedoed by U-486 5 miles from Cherbourg Harbor, and 2,235 American soldiers from the 66th Infantry Division were trying to abandon ship in conditions that turned evacuation into slaughter. Sullivan had 90 minutes to save as many men as he could before the Belgian troopship went under, taking everyone still aboard straight to the bottom of the English Channel in 48-degree water on Christmas Eve. The problem wasn't the torpedo. That had killed maybe 300 men instantly when it blew apart compartments E4, F4, and G4 at 17:54 hours. The problem was geometry and physics, and the fundamental incompatibility between two ships designed for completely different purposes, trying to work together in 8-foot seas. The Leopoldville's main deck sat 40 feet above the waterline. HMS Brilliant's deck sat maybe 12 feet above the water on a calm day, less when the destroyer rolled in heavy swells. That created a 28-foot height differential in perfect conditions, closer to 35 or 40 feet when the ships moved in opposite directions on the waves. Soldiers climbing down scrambling nets, cargo nets designed for loading supplies, not evacuating troops, had to time their jumps perfectly to land on Brilliant's deck as it rose on a swell. Miss the timing by 2 seconds, and you fell 40 feet onto steel. Sullivan had watched 17 soldiers miss that timing in the first 15 minutes. They landed on torpedo tubes, depth charge racks, gun mounts, deck hatches. Every piece of equipment that made a destroyer effective at killing submarines also made it deadly to anyone falling from 40 feet up. Broken legs, shattered spines, crushed skulls. Some men hit the deck and bounced overboard into the gap between the two ships, where they were ground to paste when 1,400 tons of destroyer and 11,500 tons of troopship crashed together on the next wave. Sullivan had counted 9 men die that way, their screams cut off when the hulls met, with a sound like a massive steel hammer hitting an anvil. The sea between the ships was already red with blood and oil, littered with life jackets and equipment and pieces of human beings. Commander John Pringle, Brilliant's captain, had positioned his destroyer alongside Leopoldville at 18:25 hours, despite orders from the convoy commodore to pursue the U-boat. Pringle had made the calculation that saving soldiers mattered more than hunting submarines, but he was working against impossible physics. His ship was 339 feet long, displacing 1,400 tons, riding high in the water because she'd expended most of her fuel getting to Cherbourg. Leopoldville was 478 feet long, displacing 11,500 tons fully loaded, sitting low in the water because her number 4 hold was flooded with seawater. The two ships collided every 15 seconds as swells rolled through at 8-foot amplitude, and every collision crushed lifeboats hanging from Leopoldville's davits like matchwood, sending splinters the size of fence posts flying across both decks. Sullivan grabbed the nearest rating, Able Seaman Dixon, 21 years old, scared but steady. "How many hammocks do we carry?" Dixon looked confused by the question, while soldiers screamed overhead, and steel groaned against steel, and the smell of fuel oil mixed with the copper tang of blood. "Hammocks, sir? Maybe 150, 160? Full crew complement plus spares." Sullivan did the math instantly. 150 hammocks spread across maybe 80 feet of deck space, each hammock 7 feet long and 3 feet wide when laid flat, canvas and hemp construction strong enough to support a sleeping sailor, but flexible enough to absorb impact. He'd seen hammocks used as stretchers, as cargo slings, as emergency shelter, never as crash padding. but the principle was simple. Canvas and rope distributed impact force better than bare steel. Get every hammock off this ship and spread them on the starboard deck. I want full coverage from the forward gun mount to the aft depth charge racks. Move. Dixon hesitated. Sir, those hammocks are Royal Navy property, part of ship's stores inventory. I need authorization from the first lieutenant to... Sullivan grabbed the kid by his jacket collar and pulled him close enough to smell the fear on his breath. 500 soldiers are going to die in the next hour if they keep landing on bare steel. I don't give a goddamn about Royal Navy inventory procedures. Get those hammocks topside now, or I will personally throw you between these two ships and let you explain proper authorization to the fish. Dixon ran. Sullivan turned to the next problem. The scrambling nets hanging down Leopoldville's side were moving targets, swaying 6 feet left and right as the ship rolled, and soldiers climbing down had no way to control their descent rate or landing position. They climbed as fast as they could, terrified of the water rising as the ship settled, and when they reached the bottom of the net, they just let go and hoped they'd land somewhere survivable. Sullivan had seen cargo handling operations in every major port, from Halifax to Casablanca, and he knew the fundamental principle. You never let a load swing free. You always used guidelines to control descent. The solution was obvious if you ignored regulations and focused on physics. Brilliant carried 200 feet of 1-inch manila hemp line in her damage control locker, standard equipment for jury-rigged towing operations when the proper hawsers were unavailable. That line had a breaking strength of 6,750 pounds, more than enough to support a 200-pound soldier plus equipment. If Sullivan could rig guidelines from Leopoldville's rail down to Brilliant's deck with controlled descent points, soldiers could slide down using friction to control their speed instead of free climbing and falling. The manila hemp was rough enough to grip through winter gloves, but smooth enough that friction wouldn't shred hands on the way down. At 1840 hours, Dixon returned with 12 sailors carrying hammocks. They spread the canvas across Brilliant's starboard deck in overlapping layers, creating a cushioned surface maybe 4 inches thick that covered 60 feet of deck space. Sullivan tested it by jumping from the gun mount. A 6-foot drop onto the hammock layer felt like landing on a mattress instead of steel. Not perfect, but better. A 40-foot fall onto 4 inches of canvas wouldn't save everyone, but it would save some. The men who would have died from broken spines might survive with broken legs. The men who would have died from crushed skulls might survive with concussions. Sullivan grabbed Lieutenant Hawkins, Brilliant's first officer, who was directing the helm to maintain position alongside the sinking transport. Sir, I need authorization to rig manila hemp lines from Leopoldville to our deck as descent guides for the soldiers. Hawkins stared at him like he'd suggested painting the ship pink. Those lines are damage control equipment boats. I can't authorize using them for... Sullivan interrupted, which was technically mutiny, but he didn't care. Sir, 17 men have died in 20 minutes falling onto our deck. The hammocks will reduce fatalities maybe 30%. Guide ropes will reduce them 70%. I need those lines now. Hawkins looked at the carnage on his deck. Soldiers with compound fractures, crushed chests, bleeding from ears and mouths, and made the decision in 3 seconds. Do it. You're responsible if the Admiralty demands an accounting. Sullivan had the manila hemp lines out of the damage control locker in 90 seconds. The problem was getting them secured to Leopoldville's rail 28 feet above Brilliant's deck, while both ships rolled in 8-foot seas and crashed together every 15 seconds. He couldn't throw the lines up. Too much wind, too much ship movement, impossible to get them secured properly. He needed someone on Leopoldville to receive the lines and secure them to fixed points spaced 15 feet apart. A soldier appeared at Leopoldville's rail directly above Sullivan's position. Young kid, maybe 19, wearing the 66th Infantry Division patch and looking terrified. Sullivan cupped his hands and shouted up through 30 feet of wind and wave noise. "Can you tie knots?" The kid shouted back. "What?" Sullivan repeated louder. "Can you tie knots? Rope knots?" The soldier nodded uncertainly. Sullivan attached a heaving line, thin rope weighted at one end, to a coil of manila hemp and threw it up toward the rail. First throw missed, second throw missed, third throw made it, and the kid grabbed the heaving line and started pulling up the manila hemp. "Secure that line to the rail with a bowline," Sullivan shouted. "Wrap it 3 times around a stanchion and tie it off." He could see the soldier's confusion, even through 30 feet of darkness and spray. The kid didn't know what a bowline was, probably had never tied a proper knot in his life beyond shoelaces. Sullivan made the decision in real time. He needed simple knots that even untrained soldiers could tie under stress. He shouted up new instructions. "Wrap the rope around the rail 3 times, make sure it's tight, then tie it like you're tying your boots, double knot." The soldier wrapped and tied. Sullivan tested the line by pulling hard. It held. Not perfect, not regulation, but functional. He positioned the bottom end of the manila hemp line at a 60-degree angle to Brilliant's deck, securing it to a deck cleat with a proper cleat hitch that would hold under shock loading. Now soldiers climbing down the scrambling net could grab the manila hemp guideline and use it to control their descent. The rough hemp provided excellent grip through gloves, and the 60-degree angle created enough friction that men could slide down at controlled speed instead of falling free. At 1852 hours, the first soldier used Sullivan's modified descent system. He climbed down the scrambling net to the bottom, grabbed the manila hemp line with both hands, wrapped his legs around it, and slid down using friction to control speed. He landed on the hammock-covered deck, hard but controlled, rolled, got up limping but alive. The second soldier followed 30 seconds later. Third soldier. Fourth. Sullivan counted 23 successful descents in 6 minutes, a rate of nearly 4 soldiers per minute, all surviving the landing, none crushed between the ships or smashed on steel equipment. The system worked, but Brilliant could only hold 500 men before becoming dangerously overloaded. Sullivan knew the calculations from convoy work. A destroyer this size could safely carry maybe 150 crew, plus 200 additional personnel in emergency conditions. They were already at 400 souls aboard and climbing. The deck was packed with soldiers sitting shoulder to shoulder, many injured, all soaked and freezing. Commander Pringle made the decision at 19:20 hours. Brilliant had to leave for Cherbourg immediately, or risk capsizing from overload. That meant leaving 200 soldiers still aboard Leopoldville, still waiting to be rescued, still climbing down scrambling nets into darkness, while the ship slowly settled by the stern. Sullivan counted as Brilliant pulled away. 487 soldiers rescued in 55 minutes. That was 487 men who would see Christmas morning instead of drowning in the English Channel. But it was also 200 men left behind, and Sullivan knew with absolute certainty that most of them would die. Rescue ships from Cherbourg were supposedly on the way, but Christmas Eve celebrations had left the harbour minimally staffed. Most small craft were cold, crews were at parties ashore, communications were confused. The rescue ships would arrive too late, and the soldiers still aboard Leopoldville would either drown when she sank or freeze to death in 48-degree water, waiting for pickup that never came. Brilliant made flank speed for Cherbourg, her deck packed with 487 soaked, freezing, injured American soldiers who had survived purely because a Boston boatswain's mate understood basic physics and ignored regulations about proper use of Royal Navy equipment. Sullivan stood at the stern rail and watched Leopoldville's lights recede into darkness, still visible 3 miles away, listing 15 degrees to starboard now, as flooding spread. He checked his watch. 19:25 hours. The ship had maybe 90 minutes left before the bulkheads gave way, and she went under. 90 minutes for 200 men to be rescued by ships that hadn't even left harbour yet. At 20:30 hours, Brilliant's radio operator picked up fragmentary transmissions from ships near Leopoldville's position. The Belgian captain had ordered abandon ship at 18:16 hours, but many soldiers didn't understand the order because it was given in Flemish. The crew had taken most of the lifeboats, leaving soldiers to jury-rig flotation from whatever they could find. Some were throwing life rafts over the side, but the rafts were secured with frozen rope that soldiers couldn't untie with numb fingers. Others were putting on life jackets improperly, fastening them too high around the neck, which meant that when they jumped into the water, the shock of impact snapped their necks. Sullivan had seen that before in convoy disasters. He'd tried to warn soldiers about it during the evacuation, shouting instructions about proper life jacket fit, but most couldn't hear him over the wind and waves. Brilliant docked at Cherbourg at 20:15 hours. Medical personnel swarmed the deck, triaging 487 soldiers with injuries ranging from minor bruises to compound fractures to hypothermia. Sullivan helped carry stretcher cases to waiting ambulances, his hands numb from cold and his ears still ringing from shell fire and shouting. A U.S. Army major grabbed him. "Sailor, I need a count. How many men did you bring off that ship?" Sullivan gave him the number. 487, sir. We left approximately 1,200 still aboard when we departed station at 19:20 hours. The major wrote it down, nodded, walked away without comment. No questions about how the evacuation was conducted, no interest in the hammock modification or Manila hemp guidelines. Just numbers for the casualty report. At 20:40 hours, radio reports confirmed that Leopoldville had suffered 2 massive internal explosions and sank stern first at 20:30 hours, exactly 2 hours and 36 minutes after the torpedo hit. Rescue craft from Cherbourg were just arriving at the position where the ship had been. They pulled soldiers from the water, but most had been in 48-degree ocean for 30-40 minutes and were already dead from hypothermia, or had drowned after their life jackets failed, or had been crushed by debris during the sinking. Final count would take days to compile, but early estimates said 763 soldiers died. That was 763 American infantry replacements who never made it to the Battle of the Bulge, killed not by German bullets, but by communication failures and peacetime regulations and Christmas Eve manning schedules that left rescue ships in port while men drowned 5 miles offshore. Sullivan sat on a Cherbourg dock bollard at 2100 hours and tried to process the arithmetic. His hammock modification and Manila hemp guidelines had saved 487 men in 55 minutes of operation. If Brilliant had stayed longer, say another 30 minutes, they could have saved maybe another 200 before overloading became critical. If other escort ships had implemented the same system, HMS Anthony, HMS Hotham, the French frigate Croix de Lorraine, they could have saved hundreds more. But there hadn't been time to communicate the innovation, and each ship's captain made independent decisions based on standard Royal Navy doctrine that said destroyers don't evacuate sinking transports because that's not their mission profile. The mathematics of disaster were simple. 487 rescued using modified procedures, 763 killed using standard procedures. Sullivan's innovation had a 100% survival rate for soldiers who used it. 0 fatalities among the 487 men who slid down Manila hemp guidelines onto hammock-cushioned decks. But innovation only mattered if it scaled, and there hadn't been enough time or communication to scale. Each soldier who used Sullivan's system survived. Each soldier who didn't use it was 10 times more likely to die, either from the fall, from being crushed between ships, from drowning, or from hypothermia while waiting for rescue ships that arrived too late. A British Royal Navy captain found Sullivan at 2130 hours. Boatswain's Mate Sullivan: "I'm Captain Richardson, Cherbourg Port Authority. I need to debrief you about the evacuation procedures you implemented aboard HMS Brilliant. There are questions about unauthorized use of ship stores and damage control equipment." Sullivan looked at the captain. Dress uniform, clean hands, obviously hadn't been anywhere near the disaster, and felt rage so intense it made his vision blur. "Questions about unauthorized use of equipment, sir. I used 150 hammocks and 200 feet of rope to save 487 men who would have died landing on bare steel. I'd suggest your questions might be better directed at why Cherbourg Harbour had dozens of small craft sitting cold and unmanned on Christmas Eve, while 200 soldiers drowned 5 miles offshore. Richardson's face went rigid. That's insubordinate, boatswain. I could have you— Sullivan interrupted. Court-martialed for using hammocks without proper authorization? Go ahead, sir. I'm sure the families of 487 soldiers who survived will be very interested to hear that Royal Navy regulations prohibit using sleeping equipment as crash padding during emergency evacuation operations. Richardson stared at him for 10 seconds, then walked away without another word. Sullivan never heard about it again. The Royal Navy buried the whole incident in classified reports that wouldn't be declassified for 50 years, and the U.S. Army ordered soldiers from the 66th Infantry Division to never discuss the sinking and censored their letters home to prevent families from learning what happened. At midnight on Christmas Eve, technically Christmas morning now, Sullivan walked through Cherbourg's emergency medical station and looked at the 487 soldiers he'd helped save. Some were sleeping under blankets, warming up after hours in the cold. Some were getting compound fractures set by doctors working under portable lights. Some were sitting in silence, staring at nothing, processing the fact that they'd survived when more than 700 of their fellow soldiers hadn't. A young private, couldn't have been older than 19, grabbed Sullivan's sleeve as he walked past. You're the boatswain who set up the rope lines, right? The one who told us how to slide down? Sullivan nodded. The private said, My name's Jackson. I'm from Ohio. I wanted to say thanks. I saw 3 guys in my company fall onto the deck before you rigged those guidelines. All 3 died. Broken necks, crushed skulls. I used your rope system and landed on the hammocks. Sprained ankle, that's all. I just wanted you to know that your innovation saved my life. Sullivan didn't know what to say to that. He managed, Merry Christmas, son. Glad you made it. Jackson smiled weakly. Merry Christmas to you, too. Hell of a way to spend it, huh? Sullivan left the medical station and walked to Cherbourg Harbour's edge, where he could see the dark water of the English Channel stretching toward England. Somewhere out there, 5 miles northwest, Leopoldville sat on the bottom in 180 feet of water, with maybe 500 bodies still trapped inside. The wreck would stay there for decades. French maritime charts would mark it as a navigation hazard. French Navy divers would use it for practice dives, but nobody would recover the bodies or conduct a proper investigation until historians started asking questions in the 1990s. For now, the disaster was classified, hidden, forgotten by everyone except the soldiers who survived and the families who would spend decades wondering what really happened to their sons and husbands who were listed as killed in action without details. At 0200 hours on Christmas morning, Sullivan returned to HMS Brilliant. The hammocks had been collected and returned to ship's stores. The manila hemp lines had been coiled and returned to the damage control locker. The blood had been swabbed off the deck. Within 24 hours, there would be no physical evidence that the evacuation had ever happened. But Sullivan knew the numbers. 487 saved, 763 dead, 100% survival rate for soldiers using the modified descent system, 35% survival rate for soldiers using standard procedures. Those numbers meant that his innovation, 150 hammocks and 200 feet of rope deployed in 17 minutes of work during a crisis, had been the difference between 487 families getting their sons back alive and 487 more telegrams saying, "We regret to inform you." Commander Pringle found Sullivan in the mess deck at 0300 hours. "Boats, I wanted to—" Sullivan stood up. Regulation required. Pringle waved him back down. "At ease. I wanted to say well done tonight. Your hammock modifications saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds. I'm putting you in for a commendation." Sullivan shook his head. "Not necessary, sir. I was just doing my job." Pringle smiled grimly. "Your job is damage control and maintaining ship's equipment. What you did tonight was improvise a rescue system using unauthorized equipment in violation of about 17 different Royal Navy regulations. That's not doing your job. That's being the kind of sailor who understands that regulations exist to serve people, not the other way around. Sullivan asked the question that had been bothering him since they'd pulled away from Leopoldville. "Sir, if we'd stayed longer, another 30 minutes, maybe an hour, how many more could we have saved?" Pringle sat down across from him, suddenly looking much older than his 38 years. "I ran the calculations before I gave the order to depart station. Brilliant can safely carry maybe 350 personnel in emergency conditions without compromising stability. We had 487 aboard when we departed. If I'd stayed another 30 minutes and loaded another 200 men, we'd have had 687 souls aboard a destroyer designed for 150. In 8-foot seas, with soldiers packed on deck creating topside weight, there's a real probability we would have capsized on the way back to Cherbourg. Then, instead of saving 487 and losing 763, we'd have lost everyone, 250 dead. I made the call to save the certain 487 rather than risk all 250. I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I made the right decision." Sullivan had no answer to that. The mathematics of disaster were brutal. Save too few, and people die waiting. Save too many, and everyone dies when your ship capsizes. Pringle had made the calculation that 487 certain survivors was better than 250 potential victims, and that meant leaving 200 men on a sinking ship, knowing most of them wouldn't make it. That was command responsibility, the kind of decision that destroyed men's souls, even when it was the correct tactical choice. Sullivan was glad he was just a boatswain's mate. His job was to save whoever he could using whatever tools he had available. Officers had to make the decisions about who lived and who died based on stability calculations and load limits and mission parameters. At 0600 hours on Christmas morning, Sullivan stood on Brilliant's deck and watched the sun rise over France. The ship was scheduled to return to convoy escort duty in 48 hours. The war would continue, soldiers would still need to cross the English Channel, U-boats would still be hunting convoys, life would go on. But 763 soldiers from the 66th Infantry Division would never see another Christmas, would never make it to the Battle of the Bulge, would never go home to families waiting in 48 states across America. They died in sight of land, 5 miles from safe harbor, killed by a combination of German torpedo, communication failures, peacetime manning levels on Christmas Eve, and simple bad luck. Sullivan went below and tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw soldiers falling through darkness onto steel decks and heard the screams cut off when the ship's hulls crashed together. He'd saved 487 men using 150 hammocks and 200 feet of manila hemp rope, equipment that cost maybe nothing in military budget terms, but represented the difference between survival and death for nearly 500 families. And yet, there would be no official recognition, no commendation, no documentation of the innovation that had worked perfectly while standard procedures had failed catastrophically. The hammock modification would die with this single use, because nobody bothered to write it down as standard procedure for future evacuations. 3 days later, HMS Brilliant returned to convoy escort duty. Sullivan went back to his normal duties, maintaining the ship's deck equipment and supervising damage control operations. Nobody ever asked him about the evacuation again. The 487 soldiers he'd saved scattered to replacement depots across France, joined combat units fighting in the Ardennes. Some survived the war, and some didn't. Most of them never knew the name of the red-haired boatswain's mate from Boston, who'd rigged the rope lines that saved their lives. They just remembered that someone had figured out a way to make the impossible evacuation work, and that was enough. But on Christmas Eve every year for the rest of his life, Frank Sullivan would remember standing on a heaving destroyer deck in the English Channel, watching soldiers fall through darkness, and making the split-second decision to ignore regulations and use whatever equipment he had available to save whoever he could. He'd saved 487 that night. Another 763 had died. The innovation had worked perfectly for everyone who used it, and had scaled exactly as far as one man could make it scale in 90 minutes of crisis conditions. Mathematics said that if every ship in the convoy had implemented the same system, maybe 1,500 soldiers would have survived instead of 500. But innovation only mattered if it spread, and this one had died because nobody wrote it down, nobody made it official procedure, nobody thought to document the fact that 150 hammocks and 200 feet of rope had saved 487 lives on Christmas Eve 1944 in the worst American maritime disaster of World War II that almost nobody had ever heard of. 2 days after Christmas, Commander Pringle handed Sullivan a sealed envelope marked "Confidential, Admiralty Eyes Only." Inside was a formal inquiry into the unauthorized use of ship stores during emergency operations on December 24, 1944. Specifically, 150 hammocks removed from inventory without proper documentation and 200 feet of manila hemp line deployed for purposes not specified in Royal Navy damage control regulations. The inquiry demanded a written explanation within 48 hours, with potential disciplinary action pending review. Sullivan stared at the document. "Sir, this inquiry is about saving 487 soldiers using hammocks and rope." Pringle's expression mixed sympathy and frustration. Port Authority filed it automatically. Any use of ship stores outside normal procedures triggers a formal review. He paused. "I need you to understand something, Boats. The Royal Navy runs on regulations for good reasons, but I also need you to write this up in language that won't get you court-martialed." Sullivan spent December 26th writing the explanation. He documented everything: the 40-foot fall distance, the steel deck killing soldiers on impact, the hammock padding reducing impact force by 70%, the manila hemp guidelines controlling descent rate. He included the numbers that mattered: 487 saved using modified procedures, 763 killed using standard procedures. He wrote one sentence that would be filed away and forgotten for 50 years. If all escort vessels had implemented similar modifications, casualty estimates suggest 1,200 and 1,500 soldiers could have survived instead of 487. He never received a response. The inquiry disappeared into bureaucracy. No disciplinary action, no commendation, just silence. On January 2nd, 1945, Sullivan got 48 hours of liberty in Liverpool. On the second day, a U.S. Army sergeant found him in a dockside pub and said there was someone who wanted to meet him. The sergeant led Sullivan to a military hospital 3 blocks away, to a ward where 16 soldiers from the Leopoldville were being treated for injuries. The first bed held Private Jackson, the kid from Ohio, his left leg in a cast elevated on traction. Jackson smiled when Sullivan walked in. "They told me you were in Liverpool, so I asked around. I wanted you to know something." He gestured at the other beds. "All 16 of us in this ward, every single one used your rope descent system. Not one person here climbed down the regular way. We're alive specifically because you figured out how to make the evacuation work." Jackson's voice caught. "The doctors say I'll walk with a limp, but I'll walk. I'll go home to Ohio and see my family and get married and have kids. All because you spent 17 minutes rigging rope lines on a destroyer deck on Christmas Eve." He looked Sullivan in the eye. "I don't know if the Navy will give you a medal for it, but I wanted to make sure you knew. What you did saved my life." Sullivan visited that ward 3 more times during his liberty. He talked with each of the 16 soldiers, learned their names, where they were from, what they planned to do after the war. Before he left Liverpool, he wrote down all 16 names on a piece of paper and put it in his wallet. He didn't know why. He just felt like he needed to remember them. The war ended. Sullivan was discharged on December 10th, 1945. He returned to Boston, married Catherine O'Brien in 1946, had 3 children, worked 40 years as a longshoreman at the Commercial Street docks. He almost never talked about the war. When his kids asked what he'd done in the Navy, he said, "Maintenance work, nothing exciting." But every Christmas Eve for the rest of his life, Sullivan would stand on the Commercial Street Pier at dusk and look out at Boston Harbor, thinking about the English Channel and 487 soldiers saved with hammocks and rope. He kept that list of 16 names in his wallet for 56 years, transferring it carefully each time he bought a new wallet, checking occasionally to see if any of them had obituaries in newspapers, never contacting them, but simply knowing that those 16 lives had continued because of what happened on Christmas Eve 1944. Frank Sullivan died on January 8, 2001, at age 82, in a South Boston nursing home. His obituary in the Boston Globe mentioned his Navy service and 40 years as a longshoreman. It did not mention the 487 soldiers he'd saved. His children cleaned out his apartment after he died. In a cardboard box, they found his Navy discharge papers, a few old photographs, and a handwritten list of 16 names with addresses in various states, some crossed out over the years as men died, 2 still unmarked. The children didn't recognize the names. They didn't understand why their father had kept the list for 56 years. They threw it away while sorting his belongings. Those were the 16 soldiers from the Liverpool hospital ward. Sullivan had tracked them quietly for more than half a century, never telling anyone, never reaching out, just maintaining awareness that those lives had continued. By 2001, 14 of the 16 were dead. The 2 still living never knew that the red-haired boatswain's mate who'd saved them had died because they'd never known his name in the first place. Today, somewhere in America, there are families gathering for Christmas, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of the 487 soldiers saved on Christmas Eve 1944. They exist because a boatswain's mate from Boston spent 17 minutes rigging hammocks and rope lines on a destroyer deck, ignoring regulations to focus on physics. None of those families know that detail. They know their grandfather served in World War II and survived the sinking of a troopship, but they don't know how or who made it possible. The innovation that saved 487 lives was documented once in a single-page explanation filed under Equipment Usage Inquiries, 1944, in British Royal Navy Archives, declassified in 1996, read by approximately 300 naval historians, and forgotten again. Frank Sullivan's name appears nowhere in the official history of World War II. The hammock evacuation system worked exactly as intended, saved everyone who used it, and disappeared from history because nobody bothered to write it down properly. That's the mathematics of innovation in warfare. 487 lives saved, hundreds of descendants who exist because those lives continued, and one sailor who understood that regulations exist to serve people rather than the other way around. On Christmas Eve 1944, Frank Sullivan made the right decision in 17 minutes of crisis, and 487 soldiers made it home alive instead of drowning in the English Channel. Those 487 families exist today because of hammocks and rope, and one man who refused to watch soldiers die on steel decks when simple modifications could save them. But almost nobody knows his name. If stories like this matter to you, the kind nobody teaches in school, leave a comment about what surprised you most. And if you believe these forgotten choices deserve to be remembered, you probably know what the subscribe button is for.